before electricity, before petroleum, before any of the infrastructure we take completely for granted. There was a period in human history when the entire industrialized world ran on something that swam. The lamps in your great-great-grandmother's house, the machines weaving the fabric of her dress, the lighthouse that guided her husband's ship safely to shore, the perfume on her wrist, the corset keeping her posture straight. All of it, every single part of it, came from one animal. An animal so strange, so biologically improbable, so perfectly engineered by 20 million years of evolution, that the men who hunted it never fully understood what they were dealing with. At its peak, the American whaling industry was the third largest industry in the entire United States. Its ships ranged across every ocean on Earth. It made a small island off the coast of Massachusetts, a strip of sand with no timber, no harbor, and almost no soil, into the wealthiest place per capita in America. It helped trigger the opening of Japan. It lubricated the Industrial Revolution. It lit the 19th century world. And it did all of that by sending men in wooden boats, armed with handheld spears, after animals the size of city buses in the middle of the open ocean. This is the full story of how whale ships kept the lights on. From the first indigenous hunters who figured out it was even possible, through the golden age of New England whaling, through disaster and obsession, and one of the most dangerous jobs in human history, all the way to the moment a single oil well in Pennsylvania ended it, almost overnight. There is a particular quality to darkness that we have almost entirely forgotten. Not the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, nor the dimness of a city street after midnight, with its amber wash of electric light spilling from 1,000 windows. The darkness that most of human history knew was absolute, a complete and total absence of illumination that settled over the land each evening like a second sky, heavy and impenetrable, broken only by firelight, by candle flame, by the faint cold silver of moon and stars when the clouds allowed. For the vast majority of human beings who ever lived, the coming of night meant the end of almost everything. Work stopped. Movement became dangerous. The world contracted to the small warm circle cast by whatever fire you could afford to keep burning. It is the early 1840s. Step into the streets of a prosperous American city, Boston perhaps, or Philadelphia, just after the sun has gone down on an October evening. The cobblestones are slick with recent rain. The air smells of horse dung and coal smoke and something else. Something faintly animal and oceanic. A scent you cannot quite place. The shops are beginning to close, their owners pulling wooden shutters across glass windows, their apprentices snuffing candles and banking fires. A lamplighter moves along the street, ahead of you, a long pole over his shoulder, stopping at each iron post to coax a small flame into life. The lamps glow yellow and warm, but their reach is modest. Between each post, the darkness reasserts itself completely. Inside a merchant's house at the edge of the city, a family gathers for the evening meal. The table is set beneath a chandelier of 6 oil lamps, and the light they produce is steady and clean and bright enough to read by. A luxury that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. The oil burning in those lamps did not come from the earth. It did not come from any mine or well or chemical process. It came from the deep ocean, from a creature of enormous size and ancient lineage, from a living animal that was at that moment being hunted by men in small wooden boats on waters thousands of miles away. The light in that dining room was the end product of a chain of violence and hardship and extraordinary human endurance that stretched from the parlours of New England to the farthest reaches of the Pacific Ocean. What lit the 19th century world was whale oil. Specifically, and most valuably, the oil rendered from the sperm whale, a creature so strange, so biologically improbable, so deeply adapted to an alien underwater world that the men who hunted it never fully understood what they were dealing with. They called the hunt a fishery, as though whales were merely large fish, pulled from the water like cod or mackerel. They called the industry a trade, as though it were no different from importing silk or exporting grain. But there was nothing ordinary about it. The American whaling industry at its peak was the third largest industry in the entire nation. The ships that prosecuted it ranged across every ocean on Earth. The men who crewed them endured conditions that most people today would find incomprehensible. And at the center of all of it, powering the lamps and lubricating the machines of an industrializing world, was the oil of a creature that had been swimming in the deep ocean for 20 million years before the first human being ever stood upright on an African plain. This is the story of how that creature came to light the world, and what that cost, and what it meant, and what was lost when it ended. It begins, as so many American stories do, on a small island off the coast of Massachusetts, on a strip of sand and scrub that the Wampanoag people had inhabited for thousands of years before Europeans arrived to transform it into the whaling capital of the world. But before we get to Nantucket, we need to understand something about the animal itself, about what made the sperm whale so uniquely valuable and so uniquely dangerous, and why its oil burned cleaner and brighter and longer than anything else the 19th century had yet found. The sperm whale is the largest toothed predator that has ever lived on this planet. A fully grown male can reach 60 feet in length and weigh as much as 60 tons. Its head alone accounts for roughly a third of its total body length, giving the animal a blunt, almost architectural appearance. A vast rectangular mass of flesh and bone, and a mysterious waxy substance that whalers called spermaceti, from the Latin for whale seed, because the first sailors who encountered it assumed wrongly that it was some kind of reproductive fluid. The head of a mature sperm whale is, in effect, a giant organ whose function took centuries to understand, and whose properties made it the most valuable substance in the natural world for the better part of 200 years. Spermaceti is not oil in the conventional sense. It is a liquid wax, a complex mixture of fatty esters and triglycerides that exists in a vast cavity inside the whale's forehead called the spermaceti organ, and it serves a purpose that scientists are still debating in its finer details, though the broad outlines are now understood. The sperm whale is a deep diver, possibly the deepest diving large mammal on Earth, capable of descending to more than 3,000 meters in pursuit of giant squid and other deep water prey. At those depths, the pressure is crushing and the temperature is near freezing, and the spermaceti organ may function as a kind of buoyancy regulator, changing its density in response to temperature and allowing the whale to hover at depth without expending energy. It may also play a role in the whale's extraordinarily powerful biosonar system, focusing and amplifying sound in ways that remain incompletely understood. But for the whalers who hunted the sperm whale, the precise biological function of spermaceti was entirely irrelevant. What mattered was what it did when you refined it, when you boiled it down and separated it and processed it in the vast copper triworks that dominated the main deck of every whale ship. Refined spermaceti produced an oil of exceptional quality, pale, nearly odorless, with a very high flash point and an unusually low viscosity in cold temperatures. When burned in a lamp, it produced a bright, clean, steady flame with minimal smoke and almost no unpleasant smell. When applied to the moving parts of machinery, it maintained its lubricating properties even under the extreme pressures and temperature variations of industrial equipment. There was nothing else like it, anywhere in the natural world. And for the textile mills and watch factories and precision instrument makers of the early industrial revolution, spermaceti oil was not a luxury, but a necessity. The sperm whale's body also yielded another product of startling value: ambergris. This is a waxy grey substance produced in the intestines of some sperm whales, apparently as a protective response to indigestible material. The hard beaks of the giant squid that make up a large part of the whale's diet. Ambergris forms slowly over years or decades inside the animal, and when a whale is killed and cut open, occasionally, rarely, a mass of it will be found, ranging in size from a few ounces to several hundred pounds. A large find of ambergris could make a whaling voyage profitable almost by itself. In the 17th and 18th centuries, ambergris was the most expensive animal product in the world, prized above all else as a fixative in the perfume industry, capable of making the most expensive fragrances cling to the skin for hours longer than they would otherwise. A single pound of high-quality ambergris could sell for the equivalent of a working man's wages for an entire year. But the sperm whale was not the only whale that mattered to the industry. The right whale, so named because whalers considered it the right whale to kill, meaning the most desirable, had been hunted in Atlantic waters for centuries before anyone ventured far enough offshore to encounter a sperm whale in numbers. The right whale is a filter feeder, a massive, slow-moving animal that lives near the surface and strains krill and copepods through the long plates of baleen that hang from its upper jaw. That baleen, flexible, strong, lightweight, capable of being shaped under heat, was the industrial plastic of its era. It stiffened corsets and petticoat frames and umbrella ribs and carriage springs. It reinforced the collars of men's shirts and provided the flexible teeth of the first mechanical weaving combs. An American woman of the mid-19th century was, in a very real sense, wearing the whale. Her elegantly narrow waist was maintained by whalebone stays. The fashionable curve of her skirt was shaped by whalebone hoops. Even the brush she used to arrange her hair before her looking glass might have bristles set in a handle of polished whale ivory. The first encounters between humans and living whales were not organized hunts, but opportunistic discoveries, enormous bodies washing ashore on beaches that had never seen anything like them. Imagine the experience of a coastal people finding a 60-foot sperm whale stranded on a beach for the first time, its vast grey body gleaming in the morning light, its strange squared head, unlike anything they had ever seen, the smell of it carrying on the wind for miles. The meat was a windfall of protein. The oil in its blubber could be rendered and used for warmth and light. The bones could be fashioned into tools. A stranded whale was not a tragedy, but a gift. And coastal peoples around the world developed traditions and ceremonies around such events that reflect both the practical value and the spiritual weight of the encounter. From opportunistic scavenging of stranded animals to the active pursuit of living whales in open boats, is a long step, and different cultures took it at different times and in different ways. But the fundamental insight that made whaling possible, that a small group of determined men in a small boat could bring down an animal 20 times their combined weight, was arrived at independently by peoples living on opposite sides of the world, and the story of how they did it and what it cost them and what they built from that courage and skill is where the real history of this industry begins. Long before any European sailor set foot in North America, and long before the word industry had been attached to the killing of whales, the Marca people of the Olympic Peninsula, on the far northwestern coast of what is now the state of Washington, were hunting grey whales and humpbacks in the open Pacific Ocean. They had been doing it according to their own oral traditions and the archaeological evidence uncovered at their village sites for at least 2,000 years, possibly longer. The Makah were, and remain, the only indigenous people in the United States with a treaty right to hunt whales, a right they negotiated directly with the federal government in 1855 and fought to preserve through the 20th century. And that right was not a novelty or an accommodation, but the recognition of something ancient and deeply embedded in who they were as a people. Maka whaling was not casual or impulsive. It was one of the most elaborate and demanding undertakings in the entire repertoire of Northwest Coast culture. A practice surrounded by months of ritual preparation, by physical training and spiritual purification, by ceremonial protocols that governed every aspect of the hunt, from the construction of the canoe to the prayers spoken over the whale's body after the kill. The whaling canoe itself was a masterpiece of engineering, a dugout vessel carved from a single western red cedar log, anywhere from 20 to 35 feet long, designed to be both fast and stable in the open ocean swells of the Pacific. The crew of 8 men who paddled it had trained together for years. The harpooner who stood in the bow had trained for even longer, learning to read the water and the weather and the behavior of the whale, learning to time the strike precisely and to brace against the shock of the harpoon's impact without being thrown into the sea. The Makah harpoon was tipped with a head of mussel shell, or, later, metal, attached to a shaft of yew wood and trailing a long line of twisted cedar bark rope connected to inflated sealskin floats. When the harpoon struck, the floats kept the whale near the surface, even as it dove and ran, and additional floats could be attached as the hunt progressed to tire the animal and slow it down. The kill, when it finally came, was made with a long lance thrust behind the whale's fin, reaching for the heart or lungs. Then came the long work of towing the carcass back to shore, a job that could take hours of exhausting paddling, followed by the ceremonies that preceded the butchering, the distribution of the meat according to carefully specified protocols of kinship and status, the rendering of the oil that would feed and light the village through the long, wet winters on the other side of the Atlantic, and in a tradition whose origins are equally ancient. The Basque people of the Bay of Biscay were developing their own whaling industry. At roughly the same time, the Makah were perfecting theirs in the Pacific, though the Basques, operating in the waters between what is now northern Spain and southwestern France, had access to right whales that came reliably to those coastal waters each autumn and winter. Basque whaling records stretch back to at least the 11th century, and by the 12th and 13th centuries, the industry was substantial enough to appear in trade documents and to generate diplomatic disputes between neighbouring kingdoms over the right to harvest the stranded carcasses of whales that washed ashore on contested beaches. The Basques were consummate maritime people, and they applied to whaling the same organisational genius that had already made them dominant in the Atlantic fishing trade for dried cod. They developed specialised vessels for the hunt, broad-beamed, relatively slow but extremely seaworthy ships designed to carry large quantities of rendered oil in barrels and to stay at sea for extended periods. They developed the technique of rendering blubber at sea in iron tripods mounted in a brick hearth on the main deck, rather than dragging whole carcasses to shore. A critical innovation that made it possible to hunt far from home ports and to process the oil before it spoiled. And they kept all of it secret. By the mid-15th century, right whale populations in the Bay of Biscay were declining, the inevitable result of concentrated hunting pressure over several centuries, and the Basques had begun to range further afield in search of new grounds. They pushed north along the coast of Europe, into the waters off Iceland and Norway, where bowhead whales were abundant. Then, sometime in the early 16th century, and this is where the history becomes genuinely extraordinary, they crossed the North Atlantic to Labrador. They were fishing the Grand Banks for cod already, as were the Portuguese and the English and the French. But the Basques went further, pushing into the Strait of Belle Isle between Newfoundland and the Labrador mainland. And what they found there was, for their purposes, a paradise. Enormous concentrations of bowhead whales fattening in the rich cold waters before their autumn migration. The Basques established a whaling station at a place they called Butas, near the modern town of Red Bay, Labrador, around 1530, nearly 60 years before the English planted their first failed colony at Roanoke. Nearly 90 years before the Pilgrims reached Plymouth Rock, they built wooden rendering facilities on shore, dug storage pits lined with boards, and constructed try-works capable of processing dozens of whales each season. At its height, the Red Bay operation was sending back to Europe as many as 1,000 barrels of oil per ship, multiple ships per season, making it, by some estimates, the largest industrial enterprise in North America for a period of roughly 60 years. And almost no one in the rest of Europe knew it was happening. The Basques guarded their discovery with fierce secrecy. Their pilots carried charts that were not shared with other nations. Their sailors were bound by oaths not to reveal the locations of the Labrador grounds. For most of the 16th century, the largest whaling operation in the world existed in a kind of deliberate historical obscurity, its products flowing into European markets, but its source unknown to competitors. It was only when the industry began to collapse, as the Labrador bowhead populations were hunted down, and the Basques themselves began to be displaced by Dutch and English rivals, armed with cannon and warships, that the secret gradually came out, and the great game of oceanic whaling entered its next phase, spreading slowly westward until it reached the island of Nantucket and transformed it into something the world had never seen before. Nantucket is a small island of sand and heath 30 miles off the southern coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a place that by any reasonable geographical assessment should never have become the center of anything at all. It has no deep water harbor. It has almost no timber. Its soil is thin and sandy and reluctant to produce much of anything. The winters are long and damp and windy, the summers short and sweet, and over too quickly. In the middle of the 17th century, when a group of English settlers purchased it from the Wampanoag Sachem Nicanus for £30 and 2 beaver hats. It was a place people came to in order to avoid other people, rather than a place anyone expected to amount to much economically. The early settlers farmed and grazed sheep on the island's limited pasture, and looked out at the ocean that surrounded them on all sides with a mixture of opportunity and anxiety. Right whales appeared regularly in the inshore waters around the island, particularly in the late autumn and winter months, and the local Wampanoag people had been harvesting stranded animals from the beaches for generations. It was from watching the Wampanoag that the English settlers first learned the practicalities of coastal whaling, learned to recognize the behavior of a whale feeding near the surface, learned how to approach in a small boat without spooking it, learned the mechanics of the harpoon and the lance, and the long work of bringing a struck whale to shore. The name most associated with the introduction of organized whaling to Nantucket is Ichabod Paddock, a whaler from Cape Cod, who arrived on the island sometime around 1690, and, according to local tradition, taught the islanders the techniques of offshore boat whaling. Whether Paddock is historical fact or founding legend embellished by a century of retelling is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that by the early years of the 18th century, Nantucket had developed a shore-based whaling industry that was beginning to attract notice from the mainland, and that the men who ran it were already casting their eyes toward the open ocean and wondering what lay beyond the horizon. The transformation from shore whaling to deep-sea whaling happened quickly and almost inevitably, driven by the same force that drives every expansion of hunting pressure. The local animals were running out. By the 1720s, right whale populations close to shore had been reduced enough that longer voyages were required. Small sloops began ranging further and further from Nantucket, staying out for weeks rather than days. Then, in 1712, a Nantucket captain named Christopher Hussey was driven far offshore by a storm, found himself in deep water surrounded by a different kind of whale, larger, blunt-headed, with teeth instead of baleen, and somehow managed to kill one and bring it home. That animal was a sperm whale, and the oil Hussey brought back was so clearly superior to anything the Nantucketers had seen before that it changed the direction of the entire industry almost overnight. The pursuit of sperm whales required going far offshore, into the deep Atlantic, and eventually beyond it. And that in turn required larger vessels, more provisions, more capital, and a fundamentally different relationship between ship owner and crew. The men who financed and organized this expansion were largely Quakers, members of the Society of Friends who had settled on Nantucket in significant numbers, and who brought to the whaling business a combination of religious conviction, community solidarity, and commercial shrewdness that proved extraordinarily effective. The Quaker ethic discouraged ostentation and personal luxury, but encouraged industriousness and the careful accumulation of wealth for the benefit of the community. And the whaling industry provided a vehicle for exactly that kind of organized, purposeful economic activity. Families like the Starbucks, the Macy's, the Coffins, and the Roches built networks of capital and credit that financed voyages, extending over months and eventually years. They owned the ships, the rigging lofts, the blacksmith shops that made the harpoons, the cooperatives that made the barrels, the counting houses that sold the oil, and the candles made from spermaceti. By the mid-18th century, Nantucket had become a fully integrated vertical monopoly in the production and sale of sperm whale oil, and the island's modest geography had been transformed by the wealth of the sea into something improbable and extraordinary. A tight, prosperous, culturally distinctive community of perhaps 5,000 souls who collectively constituted the most experienced deep-sea whaling force on the face of the earth. The smell of Nantucket in those years was, by all accounts, remarkable. The trying out of blubber into oil produced a dense, greasy, penetrating smoke that settled into everything. The timbers of the houses, the wool of the coats, the hair of the inhabitants. Visitors arriving by ferry from the mainland noted it before they could see the island's distinctive cluster of shingled rooftops above the low, sandy hills. It was the smell of commerce, of industry, of a place that had found its purpose and was pursuing it with total commitment. It was also, underneath the smoke and the brine, the smell of death, of an ocean being systematically emptied of its largest animals, so that the parlours of London and Boston and Amsterdam might be lit a little more brightly after dark. A fully equipped American whaling ship of the mid-19th century was one of the most complex and self-sufficient vessels ever built. It was not, by the standards of the day, a particularly beautiful craft. The naval architects who designed warships and packet boats and the fast-sailing clippers that were beginning to revolutionize the carrying trade would have regarded a whale ship with professional contempt. Bluff-bowed, heavily built, slow and wallowing in any kind of sea, smelling of oil and old wood and accumulated grime. But within its ungainly hull was packed everything needed for a voyage that might last 3 or 4 or even 5 years, and range from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific to the Arctic Ocean and back again. It was a floating village, a factory, a warehouse, and a community all at once. And understanding it in its physical details is essential to understanding the world of the men who sailed it. The most distinctive feature of a working whale ship was the try-works, a massive brick furnace installed permanently in the main deck, usually just forward of the mainmast, in which the ship's 2 or 3 iron tripods sat embedded in their fire brick cradles. Each tripod held several hundred gallons of blubber, cut into small pieces called Bible leaves by the men working below. The fires under the tripods burned with an infernal intensity, fed by the scraps of rendered blubber called fritters that were shoveled back into the furnace as each batch was processed. A wonderfully efficient system in which the whale, in a sense, cooked itself. The heat was extreme. The light was blinding. The smell was indescribable. And the work went on continuously, day and night, until the entire animal had been processed. The try-works turned a whale ship into something closer to a foundry than a sailing vessel, and the men who tended them developed a particular stoicism about heat and smell and continuous labor that became part of the culture of the industry. Forward of the try-works was the blubber room, a space between decks where the blubber was initially processed after being hauled aboard, cut from the whale's body in long strips by men working on the cutting stage rigged over the ship's side, hoisted aboard by the blubber hook and its massive tackle, then cut into manageable pieces by men wielding long-handled spades in close quarters, while the ship rolled in the blood and oil sloshed across the planking. The blubber room was, by every account that survives, one of the more unpleasant places in an already unpleasant existence. It was dark. It was cold in northern latitudes, and suffocatingly hot when the tryworks were operating above, it was slippery with fat, and the work required both skill and brute strength. The cooperage was another essential operation aboard ship, the making and repairing of the oak barrels in which the rendered oil was stored. A single sperm whale might yield anywhere from 15 to 90 barrels of oil, depending on the animal's size and sex. And those barrels had to be tight enough to survive months or years at sea without leaking. The ship's cooper was therefore a craftsman of real importance, capable of making a barrel from raw staves in a matter of hours, and of diagnosing and repairing leaks in existing barrels with whatever tools and materials were available in mid-ocean. Below the main deck, the hold of a whale ship was packed with empty barrels, nested inside one another to save space, waiting to be set up and filled as the voyage progressed. On the morning of departure from New Bedford, which by the 1840s had surpassed Nantucket as the preeminent whaling port in the world, the scene on the waterfront was a particular kind of controlled chaos. The docks were crowded with men carrying last-minute provisions, barrels of salt pork and salt beef, hardtack biscuits in canvas sacks, molasses, dried peas, coffee beans, tobacco. The rigging of a departing vessel was always a spectacle of last-minute adjustments, a tangle of lines being sorted and coiled, sails being bent to their yards, the compass being swung and checked against known bearings. The captain stood on the quarter-deck in his best coat, watching everything with the expression of a man who knows that the next time he sees this harbour might be 3 or 4 years hence, or might be never. The crew of a whaling voyage was assembled from an extraordinary range of backgrounds and origins. There were experienced whalemen from New England ports, Wampanoag, and other Native American men who had been going to sea from these harbours for generations, free black men from the maritime communities of New Bedford and Nantucket, Portuguese immigrants from the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, where American whale ships made regular provisioning stops, Pacific Islanders who had joined American vessels at Tahiti or Hawaii or Tonga and never gone home, escaped slaves who had made their way to the sea as the one avenue of movement and anonymity that a racially stratified society sometimes permitted. A whale ship's forecastle, the crowded sleeping quarters in the bow of the ship, was in many ways the most racially and ethnically diverse workplace in 19th century America. For weeks or months after a whale ship left port, there might be no whales at all. The ship worked its way to the hunting grounds, the Azores banks, the offshore ground in the Central Pacific, the Japan ground, sailing hundreds or thousands of miles, enduring storms and calms, making and shortening sail, fixing the rigging that inevitably broke, and replacing the provisions that inevitably spoiled, while the men settled into the grim routine of shipboard life. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, the watches alternating around the clock, so that a man was perpetually either exhausted or waiting to be exhausted again. The monotony was its own kind of hardship. Some men went weeks without hearing a word spoken to them directly. Some kept journals that record, page after page, the same entry. Nothing seen, fine weather, light breezes from the northeast. Then one morning, the lookout in the masthead crosstrees, perched in his barrel or iron hoop 90 feet above the deck, swaying through arcs of 30 or 40 feet with every roll of the ship, scanning the horizon through a spyglass, or simply with his naked eyes, would see it, the spout, a tall column of vapour erupting from the surface of the ocean, hanging for a moment in the still morning air before dispersing. 2 or 3 or a dozen such columns, close together, and the certainty that these were not right whales or humpbacks, but sperm whales, identified by the angle of their spout, which inclines characteristically forward and to the left rather than straight up. The cry that came down from the masthead then, the cry that every man aboard had been waiting for since they left port, was one of the most distinctive in the lexicon of the sea. There she blows. There she blows. What happened next happened fast. The captain emerged from his cabin. The mates went to their assigned boats. The boat crews scrambled from wherever they were, from the forecastle, from the rigging, from the try-works, from whatever makeshift task the boatswain had given them to fill the empty hours. Every man knew his role and his position. The whaleboats, 4 of them typically, each about 28 feet long and made of cedar planks so thin you could almost see through them, designed for speed rather than durability, were lowered from the ship's davits into the water. Each boat carried a crew of 6. The mate, or boat header, at the long steering oar in the stern, and 5 oarsmen facing aft, which meant they were rowing backward toward the whale, unable to see it, pulling with everything they had, while the mate directed them with muttered commands. At the bow of each boat, standing with his back to the direction of travel, and bracing himself against the clumsy cleat called the loggerhead, stood the harpooner. The approach to a sperm whale was conducted in enforced silence. Sound carries underwater, and a whale alerted to danger by the creak of an oarlock or the splash of a poorly timed stroke would simply dive and be gone. The men rowed with their oars, muffled in rags. The mate communicated through gestures and whispered commands. The gap between the boat and the whale closed in agonizing increments. 100 yards, 50 yards, 25. The whale lay on the surface between dives, breathing slowly, its enormous black back rising and falling with each breath. You could smell it from 20 yards. A warm, slightly fishy exhalation, disconcertingly close to the breath of something mammalian rather than oceanic. At 10 yards, the size of the animal became genuinely terrifying. A full-grown sperm whale alongside a 28-foot whaleboat looks approximately as a city bus would look alongside a bicycle. The harpooner's job in this moment was to plant his iron, his harpoon, deep into the whale's body, just behind and below the fin, close enough to a vital organ to hold without the iron tearing free. He threw from a standing position in the pitching bow of a small boat, a distance of perhaps 10 to 15 feet, with a harpoon weighing 6 or 7 pounds and trailing hundreds of feet of coiled line. The technique required years of practice to execute reliably. The physical strength required was enormous. And the moment the iron struck, everything changed completely. A struck whale reacted in one of several ways, all of them dangerous. Some sounded immediately, dove straight down, pulling the line out of the boat in a screaming rush that could sever a man's arm if he was careless about where his limbs were relative to the running line. Some ran on the surface, towing the whaleboat at speeds that could reach 15 or 20 miles per hour in what the whalers called a Nantucket sleigh ride. The boat skipping and crashing across the surface, spray flying, men hanging on grimly while the line sang taut as a fiddle string over the bow. Some, most dangerously of all, turned and attacked. A sperm whale in its death agony was capable of destroying a whaleboat with a single blow of its flukes, the great horizontal tail that it used to propel itself through the water. The flukes of a large male sperm whale span 15 feet or more, and a direct blow from them would splinter a cedar whaleboat as though it were made of matchsticks. There are documented accounts of whales striking at the whaleboats repeatedly, methodically, as though with deliberate intent. More rarely, but not rarely enough to be ignored, a sperm whale turned on the ship itself. The most famous such event in the history of the industry would take place in 1820, and we will come to it in detail. But even in an ordinary hunt, on a day when everything went as planned, the violence was extreme and the danger constant, and the exhaustion of pulling a 28-foot boat against the resistance of a 60-ton animal running at full speed was such that men sometimes fainted at their oars. When the whale finally tired, when the last of its strength was spent in sounding and running and thrashing, the mate in the stern took his place in the bow, exchanging positions with the harpooner in the cramped confines of a pitching boat, while still maintaining tension on the line. Then came the killing stroke, a long iron lance thrust again and again into the whale's side, searching for the lung or the heart, until the animal was mortally wounded and began to move in the tight circles that whalers called the flurry. The spout changed colour, from white vapour to something darker, pink-tinged, and then red. The whale vomited blood and rolled on its side, one fin reaching skyward like a last gesture, and then was still. The men in the boats sat in the silence that followed, in the spreading red stain of the ocean, catching their breath, looking at what they had done, measuring in their minds the barrels of oil that floated dead before them. The whaling industry ran on a compensation system called the lay, which was unusual in 19th century labour relations, and which contributed both to the industry's remarkable social diversity and to the profound economic inequality that characterized shipboard life. Rather than receiving a fixed wage, every man aboard a whale ship received a fractional share, a lay, of the total proceeds of the voyage, after the costs of outfitting and provisioning had been deducted by the ship's owners. The captain might receive a lay of 1/8 to 1/12 of the total oil. The first mate would receive a smaller share, perhaps 1/16 to 1/20. A skilled harpooner might receive 1/60. A green hand on his first voyage might receive 1/250, or even less. The lay system tied the entire crew's earnings to the success of the voyage, in a way that was supposed to encourage collective effort and shared purpose, and in some respects, it worked as intended. But the arithmetic of the lay was often cruelly tilted against ordinary seamen. The deductions made by ship owners before the lays were calculated were frequently so generous to the owners, and so niggardly to the men, that a common sailor returning from a 3-year voyage might find, after all deductions for clothing purchased from the ship's slop chest, medical attention, and various fees assessed against his account, that he owed money to the company rather than the company owing money to him. This system was not accidental. It was a deliberate mechanism for keeping labour costs low and for binding men to the industry through the perpetual promise of a good voyage that somehow never quite materialized. The men who filled whaling forecastles came from everywhere, and understanding who they were complicates any simple narrative about the industry. Amos Haskins, born in 1800 on Dartmouth, Massachusetts, to a Wampanoag mother and a black father, went to sea as a young man and rose to become the captain of the whale ship Massasoit, one of a remarkably large number of men of colour who achieved command positions in an industry that, whatever its economic exploitation, was notably more open to non-white advancement than almost any other sphere of American economic life. The historian W. Jeffrey Bolster has documented that by the 1830s, African American men made up roughly 17% of New England's seafaring workforce, with whaling ships providing proportionally more opportunities for advancement than merchant vessels. The Wampanoag men of Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard were famous throughout the industry as harpooners and boat steerers of exceptional skill, and their reputation was such that captains actively recruited from Gay Head when forming a crew. This created an interesting dynamic. Men from a Native American community whose land had been taken, whose traditional ways of life had been systematically disrupted, whose political and legal status was deeply ambiguous, were simultaneously the most sought-after specialists in an industry central to the American economy. They navigated this position with varying degrees of satisfaction and resentment, some accumulating significant savings and returning home with resources that allowed them to maintain their community's independence, others drifting deeper into the debt bondage of the lay system and spending their working lives in other people's enterprises. The hierarchy aboard a whale ship was rigid and enforced with a combination of formal authority and physical coercion that would be recognizable to anyone familiar with institutional life in the 19th century. The captain was absolute sovereign of his vessel, with the legal right to confine men in irons, to flog them for serious offences, and to make decisions about the life and safety of every person aboard without appeal or review. The three mates occupied an intermediate position. They ate apart from the forecastle crew, took their meals at a table in the cabin, and wielded authority over the men in ways that ranged from respected leadership to casual brutality, depending on the individual's temperament. The forecastle crew ate together, slept together in hammocks or narrow bunks in the cramped bow quarters, and shared a culture of watchful stoicism that was the psychological adaptation of men who had no real recourse against the conditions of their employment except the extreme option of desertion. Desertion was common. At every port of call, men slipped over the side and disappeared into the local population. In Hawaii, which the whalers called the Sandwich Islands and used as a major provisioning and rest stop, whole neighborhoods of Honolulu and Lahaina were populated by ex-whalers of every nationality, living out a perpetual shore leave. In Tahiti and the Marquesas, men found it easy to remain and difficult to leave. The contrast between life in the islands and life in the forecastle being sufficiently stark that rational calculation frequently favored desertion. Captains developed elaborate strategies for preventing it, keeping men aboard ship when in port, locking up boats, stationing watches. Herman Melville deserted his whale ship in the Marquesas Islands in 1842, spent several weeks living among the Taipi people, eventually escaped on a passing whale ship, deserted again in Tahiti, and eventually made his way home by a roundabout route. Experiences that would, in a decade, produce some of the most important literature in the English language. The opening of the Pacific Ocean to American whalers came in the stages over the last decade of the 18th century, driven by the depletion of Atlantic grounds and by a gradual accumulation of knowledge about where sperm whales concentrated in the world's largest ocean. The first American vessel to round Cape Horn in pursuit of sperm whales was the Amelia out of Nantucket in 1791. and her success in the waters off the Chilean and Peruvian coasts triggered a rush that saw dozens of American ships in the Pacific within a decade. By the 1820s, American whalers had mapped the major sperm whale grounds across the entire Pacific basin, the coast of Chile, the offshore ground in the open ocean west of the Galapagos, the Japan ground in the northwestern Pacific, and the industry had expanded to a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. It was on the offshore ground, in the central Pacific Ocean, nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest land, on a clear November morning in 1820, that the industry encountered its most famous catastrophe. The whale ship Essex, out of Nantucket, 27 men aboard under the command of Captain George Pollard, Jr., was working a school of sperm whales when one of the animals, unusually large, the first mate, Owen Chase, would later describe it as perhaps 85 feet long, though this may be an exaggeration produced by terror, turned and attacked the ship itself. The whale struck the Essex twice. The first blow staggered the ship and sent men tumbling across the deck. The second blow, delivered after the animal had retreated, turned and charged at full speed, struck the bull squarely and with sufficient force to spring the planking below the waterline. The men below decks heard the second impact before they felt it. A sound like a cannon shot, followed by the groaning of stressed timber, followed by water pouring through the breach. The Essex went down in approximately 20 minutes. 20 men survived in 3 small whaleboats, hundreds of miles from any shipping lane, with minimal provisions and no reliable navigation except the stars. What followed was one of the most harrowing survival narratives in the history of the sea, and one whose details were known to every American with access to a newspaper or a bookshelf throughout the 1820s and beyond. The 3 boats separated and made different decisions about where to go. Captain Pollard, bowing to the fears of his crew about the cannibal islands of the western Pacific, chose to sail east toward South America rather than west toward the closer Polynesian islands, a decision that condemned his men to weeks of additional sailing across empty ocean with diminishing supplies. The men died in order of their weakness. Those who had been smallest or youngest or most poorly nourished when the ship went down were the first to go. The survivors buried the first dead at sea, consigning them to the ocean with whatever ceremony they could manage from an open boat. Then the food ran out entirely, and the decision that haunts the story of the Essex was made. The bodies of those who died naturally would be consumed by those who survived. This was not, in the context of the 1820s, without precedent. There was a recognized, if deeply uncomfortable tradition among maritime people of a custom of the sea in which shipwreck survivors who had exhausted all other options resorted to cannibalism to survive. But it was a decision made in extremity by men who were half mad with thirst and hunger and exposure. And it marked everyone who made it for the rest of their lives. Captain Pollard's boat was reduced to 4 men and then to 2 before a passing ship found them after approximately 90 days at sea. The first mate, Owen Chase's boat, was found earlier, its remaining 3 men barely alive after 89 days. 1 boat was never found at all. Of the 20 men who left the Essex in open boats, 8 survived. Owen Chase wrote a narrative of the ordeal while still aboard the rescue vessel. Working from memory and from brief notes he had managed to keep during the voyage, and it was published to immediate and enormous success in 1821 The story spread quickly through the maritime community and beyond. It was the kind of story that people needed to tell and retell, that seemed to contain within it some essential truth about the relationship between human ambition and natural power. Herman Melville read Chase's narrative as a young man and was so affected by it that when he met Owen Chase's son at sea years later and borrowed a copy of the book from him, he scribbled agitated notes in the margins, working out connections to ideas he was already beginning to form about the ocean and the whale and the nature of obsession. The Essex disaster gave Moby Dick its climax. The white whale that destroys the Pequod is, among many other things, the Essex whale transformed by Melville's imagination into something mythological. But it also gave the whaling industry something more immediate, a renewed awareness of the danger that had always been present in the hunt, and a particular quality of respect, tinged with dread, for the animal at the center of it all. The loss of the Essex did not slow the expansion of the industry. If anything, the intensity of the hunt increased in the decades that followed, as new grounds were discovered, and new generations of men went to sea with an appetite for the lays that a successful voyage could pay. The disaster was absorbed into the mythology of the business, becoming proof of danger rather than argument against it. The ocean was understood to be hostile, the whale to be dangerous, and the men who went to sea anyway to be a particular kind of human being worth admiring. In New England culture, the whaling captain occupied a position somewhere between naval hero and frontier explorer, a man who had ventured into the unknown and returned with something of value, or had not returned at all, which was its own kind of honor. To understand why the whaling industry grew so relentlessly through the first half of the 19th century, it is necessary to understand how completely whale oil permeated the physical fabric of industrial civilization. This was not a luxury trade, not a niche market for wealthy consumers seeking exotic products. Whale oil was, in the most literal sense, an infrastructure material, a substance so deeply embedded in the operations of the industrializing world that its removal would have caused the entire system to seize and halt as surely as removing the oil from a running engine. The textile mills that were transforming the economies of New England and the English Midlands ran on whale oil. The spindles and looms of Lowell, Massachusetts, and Manchester, England required constant lubrication to function at the speeds that industrial production demanded, and the lubricants available in the early 19th century, most of them plant-based or animal fats of varying quality, deteriorated quickly under the heat and friction of continuous operation. Sperm oil, by contrast, maintained its lubricating properties at temperatures that would have turned other oils into varnish, and it did not corrode the metal parts it touched. A mill superintendent in 1840 who was told he would have to manage without sperm oil would have faced a very serious problem. The watchmaking and precision instrument industries had a similar dependency. The intricate gear trains and escapement mechanisms of a fine clock or marine chronometer required a lubricant of extraordinary purity and consistency, one that would not dry out, would not gum up, would not introduce any unpredictable variation into the behavior of the mechanism. Sperm oil, particularly the lightest grades produced from the head matter of large sperm whales, was the only substance that reliably met these requirements, and the watchmakers of Switzerland and England imported it in quantities that made the trade significant even by comparison with the much larger demand from the textile industry. The lighthouses that guided ships along the coasts of every maritime nation burned whale oil in their great Fresnel lenses. those remarkable optical instruments designed by the French physicist Augustin Jean Fresnel in the 1820s, which concentrated light from a single flame into a beam powerful enough to be seen 20 miles at sea. The quality of the oil burning in a lighthouse lens mattered enormously. A lamp that smoked or dimmed unpredictably, that required frequent trimming, that produced uneven light, could cause a ship to misjudge a dangerous coastline and be lost. Lighthouse keepers kept meticulous records of the quality of different oil shipments, and the best-run lights consistently specified sperm oil as their preferred fuel. Beyond the oils and lubricants, the other products of the whale trade wove themselves into everyday material culture in ways that are easy to overlook because they are now so thoroughly replaced by synthetic equivalents. Baleen, those long, flexible plates from the upper jaw of the right whale, made of keratin, the same protein that forms human fingernails, was the engineering plastic of the 19th century. It was strong, lightweight, flexible, waterproof, and could be shaped under steam heat and would hold its new form on cooling. Corset manufacturers were by far the largest single consumers of baleen, but the material also found its way into umbrella ribs, fishing rod tips, buggy whip handles, the stiffening of hat brims, the springs of early carriages, and the blades of some cutting tools. Perhaps the most geopolitically significant use of whale oil and its products was as the instrument of American foreign policy in Asia. When Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay in 1853 and presented the Japanese government with a demand that they open their ports to American ships, the economic rationale behind the demand was substantially about the whaling industry. American whale ships ranged across the North Pacific in large numbers, and their need for sheltered harbors in which to provision, make repairs, and rescue shipwrecked crews had become, from the American government's perspective, a matter of national necessity. Japan's continued refusal to permit American ships to enter its ports was understood in Washington primarily as an obstacle to the whaling trade. And the opening of Japan, one of the defining events of the 19th century Pacific world, with consequences that reverberate to the present day, was, in no small part, an act performed on behalf of the whale fishery. Every narrative of whaling eventually confronts the same asymmetry. The ships went to sea, the men went with them, and the women stayed behind. This is true as a statistical description of how the industry worked, but it obscures something important about the actual social reality of whaling communities. The degree to which women were not merely passive spectators of their husbands' and sons' departures, but active participants in the economic and social life that the industry produced, and sometimes participants in the voyages themselves. The widows' walks, those distinctive rooftop platforms on New England houses, the observation decks with their wooden railings and their views of the harbour, are part of the mythology of whaling towns. And like most myths, they contain both truth and embellishment. Women certainly did go to rooftops and widows' walks to watch for returning ships, and the habit of waiting and watching was a real and defining feature of life in places like Nantucket and New Bedford. But the image of the passive, pining wife waiting for her husband is a 19th century romantic construction that does not capture the full reality of women's lives in these communities. Because their husbands were absent for years at a time, women in whaling households necessarily managed everything that needed managing. The finances of the household, the education of the children, the maintenance and sometimes the renting or sale of property, the complex negotiations with agents and merchants, who handled the business affairs of the voyage. Nantucket women developed a reputation throughout New England for unusual competence and independence in commercial matters, and more than one observer commented with surprise on the confidence and directness with which Nantucket women conducted business dealings that would have been considered the exclusive province of men almost anywhere else in America. The letters that survive from these years are extraordinary documents, not only as records of separation and longing, but as evidence of the texture of daily life in communities shaped by absence. A wife, writing to her husband on a voyage that had already lasted 2 years, might discuss the condition of the house, the progress of the children's schooling, the price of provisions, the latest news from neighboring families whose husbands were also at sea, and the state of her own health and spirits, in a tone of careful equanimity that almost certainly conceals the anxiety and loneliness beneath it. The letters she sent rarely arrived. She could never know which port her husband's ship might be calling at, and letters sent to Honolulu or Valparaiso or the Azores might wait months or years before being collected. The communication was essentially one way, a long and slow conversation in which years might pass between question and answer. Some women chose not to be left behind at all. The practice of wives accompanying their husbands on whaling voyages was never common, but was not unheard of, particularly from the 1840s onward, and the journals kept by these women constitute some of the most vivid and unexpected documents of the industry. Mary Brewster sailed with her husband, Captain William Brewster, on the voyage of the ship Tiger in 1845, beginning a series of voyages that would keep her at sea for years. Her journal, recently rediscovered and published, records the daily life of a whaling voyage with the eye of someone for whom nothing about it is routine or invisible, someone who has not yet been numbed by familiarity into the practiced indifference that characterizes most whalemen's logs. She describes the first whale chase she witnesses with the unguarded excitement of someone who cannot pretend to the casual professionalism of the crew. The boats going down, the running of the line, the sounds and smells of the kill. She also describes the loneliness of being the only woman aboard a ship of 30 men, of having no one to talk to as an equal, of watching the work of the ship go on around her, and understanding most of it, but belonging to none of it. Her journal is, among many other things, a portrait of a marriage conducted in the cramped quarters of a ship's cabin, at the center of a masculine institution that had no real place for women, even as it depended on them completely. Between the moments of crisis and labor, between the sleigh rides and the try-works and the endless pulling at the oar, there were months of empty ocean and nothing to do. A whaling voyage was, in its ordinary texture, one of the more profoundly boring experiences available to a 19th century human being, and the culture that grew up in the forecastle to fill that emptiness was a genuine folk culture, spontaneous, inventive, shaped by the particular conditions and materials of the whaleship world, and producing artifacts and traditions that are among the most distinctive in American history. Scrimshaw is the most enduring of those artifacts. The carving and engraving of whale teeth and whale bone by whalemen during the idle hours of a long voyage, using jackknives and sail needles and whatever pigments were available to rub into the incised lines and make them visible. The word itself is of uncertain origin, possibly from a Dutch term meaning to whittle or to do trifling work, though some scholars have connected it to the name of an early practitioner. What is certain is that the practice became near universal among American whalemen during the great years of the industry, and that the objects it produced range from rough and tentative scratchwork on small whale teeth to pieces of genuine artistic accomplishment. Complex engraved scenes depicting ships and whales and whaling operations, portraits of wives and sweethearts worked from miniature daguerreotypes brought from home, decorative boxes and corset busks and swift, the reel-like tools used for winding yarn, carved with intricate geometric patterns, and presented as gifts on the whaleman's return. The subjects that recur in Scrimshaw are revealing. Ships are everywhere. The whale ship itself, seen from outside, her lines idealized, and her rigging perfect in a way that actual ships never quite were. Whales appear frequently, sometimes as the quarry in dramatic hunt scenes, and sometimes simply as themselves, floating serenely on an engraved ocean that bears no resemblance to any actual body of water. Patriotic imagery, eagles, flags, portraits of presidents, mixes with erotic imagery, with religious iconography, with portraits of women whose relationship to the carver can only be guessed at. The overall impression is of an art form shaped by isolation and longing, by men who are far from home and filling their spare hours with images of everything they had left behind. The musical culture of the forecastle was equally distinctive and equally shaped by the conditions of the work. Sea shanties, the work songs that accompanied the manual labor of sailing a ship, were functional as much as aesthetic, their rhythms calibrated to coordinate the effort of many men pulling or pushing or hauling in unison. The capstan shanty, sung while men walked in circles to raise the anchor, had a different character from the halyard shanty, sung while hauling a line, which was different again from the pumping shanty, sung while working the bilge pumps in a long, weary, rhythmic stroke. Each type had its own temporal structure, its own call and response pattern between the shantyman who led and the crew who answered, its own repertoire of verses that could be extended or abbreviated depending on how much work remained to be done. Herman Melville spent 18 months at sea as a whaleman in the early 1840s on the Acushnet out of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, from which he eventually deserted in the Marquesas. And the experience was the foundation of everything he would write for the next decade and beyond. He was not a particularly skilled or enthusiastic whaleman by any account. He was a poor hand at the oar, prone to daydreaming on watch, and possessed of a quality of intense observation and intellectual restlessness that made him an awkward fit for the hierarchical, physically demanding culture of the whale ship. But he watched everything and remembered everything and talked to everyone who would talk to him. And when he sat down a decade later to write what became Moby Dick, he produced a book that is simultaneously a meticulous technical manual of the whaling industry, a philosophical meditation on obsession and fate and the nature of knowledge, and one of the great novels in the English language. Moby Dick was published in 1851 and was, by the standards of the literary marketplace, a failure. It sold poorly, was received with confusion by critics who had expected another adventure narrative like Melville's earlier books, and contributed to the eclipse of his reputation that would last until after his death. But as a historical document, Moby Dick is invaluable. A detailed insider account of how the industry worked, what it felt like from the inside, what the men who prosecuted it thought about the whales they were killing, and the ocean they were crossing, and the lives they were leading. No other account of 19th century whaling captures the physical reality of the forecastle, the try-works, the masthead, the whaleboat in the same way, and no other account comes close to capturing the metaphysical weight that the industry carried for those who were part of it. By the middle of the 19th century, the great whaling grounds of the Atlantic and the Central Pacific had been hunted for long enough that the effort required to find and kill a sufficient number of whales to fill a ship's hold had increased dramatically. Captains who had made successful voyages in the 1820s on 3-year passages were finding by the 1850s that similar voyages required 4 or 5 years to achieve the same result. And even then, the outcome was uncertain. The sperm whale was not yet commercially extinct in any of its traditional grounds, but it had become rare enough in the most heavily worked areas that whalers had to travel further and wait longer for each strike, and the economics of the industry were beginning to reflect the pressure that a century of intensive hunting had placed on the population. The response of the industry to declining catch rates was the same as it had always been. Push further, push harder, go where other ships had not yet gone. The Pacific grounds had been extended progressively northward as the century advanced, with captains venturing into the cold waters of the northern Pacific and eventually into the Arctic Ocean itself. The bowhead whale of the Arctic, a massive animal even larger than the sperm whale, heavily laden with blubber to sustain itself through the polar winter, was present in numbers that seemed inexhaustible to the first captains who encountered it in the late 1840s, and the rush into Arctic waters that followed was among the most aggressive expansions in the history of the industry. Arctic whaling required modifications to technique and equipment. The ice was the constant threat, the constant adversary, the presence that shaped every decision a captain made from the moment he entered the Bering Strait in late spring to the moment he retreated south again before the freeze in late summer. Ships were strengthened with extra planking at the bow and along the waterline where the ice was most likely to bear against the hull. Captains learned to read the ice, to distinguish between new ice, which was thin and brittle and could be pushed through with a careful approach, and old ice, which was deep and hard and would hold a ship as firmly as a vice if it closed in around her. The summer of 1871 brought weather patterns that nobody on the Arctic grounds had seen in their experience. The ice that should have retreated northward as the season advanced instead held stubbornly in place, and then, in late August, began to move in ways that alarmed the most experienced captains. 33 American whale ships were working the waters north of the Bering Strait when the ice began to press southward, from the north and eastward from the pack, compressing the channel of open water between the ice and the Alaskan shore into a strip so narrow that movement became impossible, and the threat of being beset, trapped by ice that would hold the ships until it crushed them, became real and imminent. The captains conferred. They argued. Some believed the ice would release before the final freeze. Others were convinced it would not, and that waiting was a gamble with the lives of 1,200 men. The decision that was finally reached was catastrophic in its immediate consequences and remarkable in its outcome. To abandon the ships, 1,200 men and women, for some captains had their wives aboard, left their vessels and made their way south in small boats through the narrowing leads in the ice. 33 ships left behind to whatever fate the Arctic had in store for them. They were picked up by the 7 ships that had remained south of the ice, and all 1,200 souls survived. The 33 abandoned ships were crushed and sunk by the advancing ice that winter. The property loss was enormous. The insurance claims alone contributed to the financial strain that was already weakening the whaling industry. But the loss of life was miraculously zero. The 1871 Arctic disaster did not end American whaling, but it contributed to a growing awareness that the industry was in a precarious state, that the grounds which had sustained it for a century were giving way, that the margins were thinning, that the era of easy abundance that had made the Nantucket merchants rich and had lit the world was passing. And by 1871, the economic challenge to whale oil had already been developing for more than a decade, pushed by a series of innovations that were transforming how the industrialized world thought about fuel and light. The story of how whale oil lost its dominance is not a simple story of one technology replacing another overnight. It is a slower, more complex story of incremental substitution, of economic pressures building gradually, of alternatives that were sometimes better and sometimes worse, but that were, crucially, available in quantities that the whale fishery could not match as industrial civilization expanded its appetite for light and lubrication at a rate that no number of whaling ships could keep pace with. Coal gas, produced by heating coal in the absence of air and piping the resulting flammable gas through underground pipes to burners at the point of use, had been lighting city streets and large buildings in Britain since the first decade of the 19th century. The Gas Light and Coke Company began operating in London in 1812, and its success triggered a rapid expansion of municipal gas systems across Britain and then the United States. By the 1830s, most major American cities had gas lighting in their downtown districts, and the quality of coal gas illumination, brighter, more consistent, and more convenient than oil lamps, made it clearly superior for large fixed installations. But coal gas required pipes, and pipes required investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure meant that gas lighting was confined to cities and large towns. For the vast majority of Americans who lived in rural areas or small towns without gas mains, the oil lamp remained the only option, and whale oil remained the most desirable fuel for oil lamps among those who could afford it. The challenge to whale oil in this market came from a different direction, from the explosive, uncertain, but very cheap alternative known as camphene. Camphene was a mixture of turpentine and alcohol, distilled and blended in various formulations that burned brilliantly, more brilliantly, in fact, than whale oil, at a price that undercut sperm oil significantly. It was also, as its users discovered with some frequency, prone to catastrophic accidents. The flash point of camphene was very low, meaning that the vapor above the surface of the liquid in a camphene lamp was almost always flammable, and that a lamp knocked over, or a wick that flared up unexpectedly, or a careless refilling while the lamp was still hot, could produce a fire of terrifying speed and intensity. Camphene fires killed people regularly throughout the 1840s and 1850s, and the insurance companies that covered buildings containing camphene lamps charged premiums that reflected their actuarial judgment about the risks involved. Despite its dangers, camphene ate into the market for whale oil among price-conscious consumers throughout the 1840s, and its presence depressed the price that whale oil could command in a competitive market. The whaling industry responded not by lowering its costs. The fundamental economics of the lay system and the long voyages made cost reduction difficult, but by emphasizing the superior quality and safety of whale oil in its marketing. a pitch that resonated with buyers who had witnessed or heard about camphene fires. But the combination of coal gas in cities and camphene in the countryside had already weakened the industry's position significantly before the arrival of the competitor that would prove fatal: kerosene distilled from petroleum. Edwin Laurentine Drake was not a particularly impressive man by any conventional measure. He was 40 years old in 1859, a former railroad conductor in uncertain health, possessed of no engineering credentials, no geological training, and no practical experience with mining or drilling of any kind. He had been hired by the Seneca Oil Company of New Haven, Connecticut, on the strength of his railroad pass, which allowed him to travel cheaply, and his possession of an honorary title of colonel that made him sound more impressive than he was. His assignment was to go to Titusville, Pennsylvania, a small town on Oil Creek in the northwestern corner of the state, and to find a way to extract petroleum from the ground in useful quantities. Petroleum was not unknown in western Pennsylvania. Oil Creek had been named for the oily substance that seeped from the ground along its banks, fouling the springs that local people used for drinking water, and coating the surface of the creek with an iridescent slick. Local people had been collecting this oil for decades, using it as a lubricant, a medicine, a sealant, and occasionally as a fuel. But the quantities available from natural seeps were too small to be commercially significant. What Drake's employers believed, based on the analysis of a Yale chemistry professor named Benjamin Silliman Jr., whose 1855 report on petroleum from western Pennsylvania had excited considerable interest in investment circles, was that larger quantities of oil lay underground and could be reached by drilling. The idea of drilling for oil was not self-evident. The techniques existed. Salt brine wells had been drilled throughout the Appalachian region for decades, and the equipment for percussion drilling in relatively soft rock was available and understood. But no one had thought to apply salt well drilling specifically to the problem of producing petroleum in commercial quantities. And when Drake arrived in Titusville and began his preparations, his neighbors regarded the project with a mixture of amusement and skepticism that he later recalled with understandable bitterness. The drilling itself was slow, plagued by equipment failures, by financial crises as Drake's backers repeatedly threatened to withdraw their funding, by the practical problem of the well walls collapsing before significant depth could be reached. Drake solved the collapse problem by driving iron pipe down into the bedrock as the well progressed, a technique that became standard in the industry. By August of 1859, he had reached 69 feet. On a Saturday evening, August 27th, his driller, William Smith, Drake himself was not present, lowered a rod into the hole and felt a different resistance than the rock they had been working through. He stopped for the night. The following Sunday morning, Smith arrived at the well and looked down into the pipe. He could see something dark and gleaming, 6 or 7 feet below the top of the casing. He dipped a tin cup on the end of a stick down into the pipe and brought it up, full of dark liquid. Drake arrived shortly after to find his driller standing by a well that was filling with petroleum at a rate that suggested something far larger than a surface seep beneath their feet. By the end of the day, they were pumping 25 barrels of oil a day from Drake's well, and the news was spreading through every wire of the telegraph network that connected the American East. The rush that followed was instantaneous and transformative. Within months, Oil Creek Valley had been transformed from a pastoral agricultural landscape into one of the most chaotic industrial scenes in American history. A landscape of wooden derricks covering every available hillside, of muddy roads jammed with wagons carrying equipment in and barrels of oil out, of boom towns thrown up in weeks and burned down by the fires that were a constant feature of petroleum country. The price of oil fell almost immediately as production ramped up, and entrepreneurs who had been watching the petroleum industry with great interest moved quickly to address the obvious market need. A clean, safe, affordable lamp fuel that could be refined from this crude oil in large quantities. Kerosene, a light fraction of petroleum, distilled from crude oil by processes that were already being developed in Scotland and Canada before Drake's discovery, was that fuel. It burned clean and bright, with only a faint smell compared to the rancid odors of some cheaper oils. It was safe by comparison with camphene. It was available in quantities that would have seemed impossible to the whale fishery. And it was cheap. Devastatingly cheap compared to sperm oil, which had been selling at anywhere from $1 to $2.50 per gallon for most of the 1850s. Within 2 years of Drake's discovery, kerosene was selling at under $1 a gallon and falling. Within 5 years, the market for whale oil as a lamp fuel had effectively collapsed. The captains in New Bedford received the news with a mixture of disbelief and grim recognition. The whale oil market was not gone overnight. The lubricant market for sperm oil persisted for years, and the baleen market continued as long as women wore corsets. But the lamp oil market, which had been the primary driver of the industry's growth for a century, was over. The prices recorded in the New Bedford merchants' accounts tell the story with merciless clarity. The same grade of sperm oil that had commanded $2 per gallon in 1860 was selling for 50 cents in 1895 and continuing to fall. The decline of the American whaling industry was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow recession, a drawing back like a tide going out, leaving behind stranded vessels, emptied warehouses, and the ghost architecture of a prosperity that was never coming back. New Bedford, which had reached its peak as the wealthiest city per capita in the United States in the years around 1857, began to reinvent itself as a textile center, its whaling families investing their accumulated capital in cotton mills that eventually employed the immigrant labor flooding into New England from Portugal and the Azores and French Canada. Nantucket, lacking even the limited geographic advantages of New Bedford, simply diminished, its population falling, its houses emptying, its long tenure as a place that mattered to the world coming quietly to an end. The ships that remained in the whaling trade after the petroleum revolution were operated by men who either could not find another business or who were committed to the industry by temperament and tradition beyond any calculation of profit and loss. The voyages continued to go out from New Bedford through the 1860s and 1870s and into the 1880s, reduced in number and increasingly marginal in economic terms, sustained by the sperm oil lubricant trade and by the baleen market that the fashion industry kept alive. The men who crewed these later voyages were often the least desirable recruits, men who had no other options, or who had gotten into debt with outfitters who effectively owned them, or who were running from something ashore, and had found in the perpetual motion of a whale ship a kind of sanctuary from consequences. The last of the great wooden whale ships, the vessels that represent the physical heritage of the industry, as nothing else quite does, is the Charles W. Morgan, built in New Bedford in 1841, and now preserved at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut as the last surviving wooden whale ship in the world. The Morgan made 37 voyages between her launch in 1841 and her final voyage in 1921. 80 years of continuous operation that took her around Cape Horn multiple times, into the Arctic, across every ocean on Earth. She survived hurricanes and ice, and the collapse of the industry she served. And she is now, appropriately, one of the most carefully preserved artifacts of American maritime history. The Morgan's career was as varied as the industry itself. In her early voyages, she operated under the full-press conditions of the mid-century industry. Large crews, aggressive hunting, try-works running around the clock during successful periods. In her later voyages, as the industry contracted, her crews were smaller and her voyages shorter, and her economic rationale increasingly questionable. She carried, over the course of her career, something like 2,000 individual whalemen, from Nantucket Quakers and Wampanoag harpooners in her early years to Cape Verdean and Portuguese immigrants and Hawaiian seamen in her later ones. Her cargo holds carried something approaching 54,000 barrels of whale oil and sperm oil, along with quantities of baleen that represented the deaths of hundreds of whales across 8 decades. The men who sailed her in those final years were doing something that was already becoming historical, even as they did it. The great voyages of the 1840s and 1850s were within living memory. Old men in New Bedford could remember when the harbour was thick with departing ships, when the trying out smoke was constant, when the whole city smelled of oil, and the streets were full of men fresh from the sea, spending their lays in ways that the Quaker merchants who had originally built the industry would have found deeply distressing. By the 1890s, all of that was memory, and the men still going to sea were going in the shadow of something that had already passed. The human history of whaling, its economics, its culture, its remarkable characters, and its terrible violence, tends to crowd out the other history that runs alongside it. The history of the whales themselves, and what the industry's century of intensive hunting did to their populations, their social structures, their behavior, and ultimately their ability to survive in an ocean that was being transformed in ways the whalers never anticipated and would not have cared about if they had. The population of sperm whales at the beginning of the American whaling era is impossible to know with precision. The best estimates, derived from the industry's own records of catch and effort, combined with modern population models, suggest that perhaps 1 million sperm whales swam the world's oceans before intensive hunting began. A number that sounds large until you understand that sperm whales are slow reproducers, with females bearing a single calf every 4 to 6 years after a gestation period of 15 months, and with young animals requiring years of social learning before they can function independently. A population of 1 million animals, reduced by hunting, at the rates the industry achieved in its peak years, would take generations to recover, even if the hunting stopped entirely tomorrow. The right whale suffered more immediately. The right whales of the North Atlantic had been hunted for centuries by the time American whalers entered the picture in force. And by the mid-19th century, the North Atlantic right whale was so rare that it had essentially ceased to be a commercial target. The population that survives today, perhaps 300 to 400 individuals, the most endangered large whale in the world, is the remnant of that long depletion, and its continued survival in the face of ship strikes, fishing gear entanglement, and climate-driven changes to its feeding habitat is, in a very real sense, a direct consequence of what the Basques and the early American whalers did to its ancestors. What the whalers could not have known, and what has only become understood clearly in the decades since the practice ended, is that sperm whales and right whales and bowhead whales are not merely large fish, not merely biological machines that convert plankton or squid into oil. They are highly intelligent, long-lived, socially complex animals whose communities are structured around matrilineal family groups, cultural transmission of learned behaviors, and communication systems of extraordinary sophistication. The songs of humpback whales are the most complex acoustic compositions produced by any non-human animal. The clicks of sperm whales, which can be heard for miles through the deep ocean, carry information whose full content we are only beginning to understand. What the whaling industry destroyed over the course of its long reign was not just a resource, it was a culture. When the American whaling industry collapsed after 1860, the whales had a brief respite. But the 20th century brought industrial whaling on a scale that made the hand harpoon era seem almost artisanal by comparison. Factory ships equipped with explosive harpoons fired from cannon and powered by steam engines could chase down the fastest whale and kill it in seconds. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth, reaching 100 feet in length and 200 tons in weight, was nearly exterminated in a matter of decades by Norwegian and British and later Japanese and Soviet factory ships operating in Antarctic waters. By the middle of the 20th century, the great whale populations of the world had been reduced to fractions of their former numbers, and the International Whaling Commission's moratorium on commercial whaling, finally enacted in 1986, came too late to save many populations from the edge of functional extinction. The slow recovery of some whale populations in the decades since the moratorium has been one of the more remarkable ecological stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Humpback whale numbers in the North Atlantic have rebounded significantly. Some populations of blue whales have shown signs of recovery, though they remain at perhaps 3 to 5% of their pre-exploitation numbers. The bowhead whale of the Western Arctic, once hunted nearly to extinction by the very ships whose disaster we described earlier, has recovered to a population of perhaps 10,000 animals, a figure that represents, in the context of what was lost, a partial restoration of something that seemed gone forever. Walk through the streets of New Bedford today, and you are walking through the physical remains of a vanished civilization. The granite counting houses along the waterfront, their thick walls built to survive the New England climate for generations, still stand with the solidity of things made to last. The Seaman's Bethel, the Sailor's Chapel, whose cenotaphs to the men lost at sea, Herman Melville, described in the opening chapters of Moby Dick, is still there, its pulpit shaped like a ship's bow, its walls lined with marble tablets bearing the names of men who went to sea and did not come back. The New Bedford Whaling Museum holds the largest collection of whaling artifacts in the world: harpoons and lances and logbooks, scrimshaw and portraits, the reconstructed bones of a blue whale suspended from a ceiling that dwarfs every visitor who stands beneath it. Nantucket has become something entirely different from what it was: a resort island for the wealthy. Its old Quaker severity transformed by a century of tourism into something picturesque and expensive. But the bones of the old Nantucket are still there if you know where to look. the captains' houses with their widows' walks, the old mill that ground corn for the island's earliest settlers, the Hadwin House, with its interior as it appeared in the prosperous 1840s, and the Whaling Museum on Broad Street with its sperm whale skeleton and its collection of scrimshaw that still carries the handiwork of men who made it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean 2 centuries ago. The language we use carries traces of the whaling era in ways so embedded that we rarely notice them. The expression loose cannon comes from naval and maritime life. A cannon that had broken free of its lashings on a ship's deck was one of the most dangerous objects imaginable, rolling freely with the ship's motion, crushing men and destroying equipment without pattern or purpose. The phrase "to know the ropes" derives directly from the sailor's necessary knowledge of which of the hundreds of lines aboard a square-rigged vessel controlled which sail, knowledge that distinguished an experienced seaman from a landlubber immediately. The idiom, by and large, meaning in general or on the whole, comes from sailing terminology, describing a ship's handling ability in different wind conditions relative to its course. The Industrial Revolution that whaling helped to sustain left a world that was, in its fundamental structure, the world we inhabit today. The textile mills that sperm oil kept running produced the mass consumer goods that created the expectation of cheap manufactured products that has defined modern economic life ever since. The precision instruments that sperm oil lubricated produced the accurate navigation and accurate timekeeping that made global trade and global communication possible. The lighthouses that whale oil lit marked the coasts that commerce had to navigate to connect an industrializing world's producers and consumers. None of this was caused solely by the whale fishery, but all of it was shaped by the whale fishery in ways that ripple forward to the present. There is something worth pausing over in the recognition that the machine age, the age of steam and steel and mass production that transformed human civilization more radically than any development since the agricultural revolution, was, in its early decades, lubricated and lit by the rendered fat of animals that had been swimming in the deep ocean since before the first primate climbed a tree. The transition from biological fuels to fossil fuels, from whale oil to petroleum, was less a clean break than a relay race, with one substance passing the baton to the next, while the fundamental project, the project of industrial civilization, of turning natural resources into economic growth at whatever cost to the natural world, continued uninterrupted. We did not stop consuming nature when we stopped consuming whales. We simply found a different part of nature to consume. Come back, one last time, to that house on a wet October evening in the early 1840s. The lamps are lit. The family is gathered. The light falls warm and steady on the faces around the table. A mother serving soup. A father unfolding a newspaper. Children bent over books. The light seems to come from nowhere in particular, as light always seems to come from nowhere in particular when you are inside it rather than thinking about it. It is simply present, simply necessary, simply the difference between seeing and not seeing, between the domestic warmth of the lit room and the cold darkness pressing against the windows from outside. But the oil in those lamps has a history, and that history is extraordinary. It began with a sperm whale swimming in the deep Pacific Ocean, perhaps 1,000 miles from the nearest land, in water so dark and cold that the light of the surface world was entirely absent. The whale was mature, perhaps 40 years old, sperm whales can live for 70 years. And it was hunting giant squid in the lightless depths, using a biological sonar system of staggering precision to locate prey in absolute darkness. Its massive body, neutrally buoyant at a depth that would crush an unprotected human being in seconds. The whale had a history of its own. It knew, in some meaningful sense, other whales. It communicated with them in a language of clicks and coders that its ancestors had been developing for 20 million years. It was part of a social world of considerable complexity, whose full dimensions we are only beginning to understand. Then a whale ship appeared on the surface far above it, and men in a small boat lowered onto the ocean and rowed toward the spot where the whale would surface to breathe. They had crossed 3,000 miles of open ocean to be there. They had endured conditions of physical hardship and institutional exploitation that most people in comfortable lives would find impossible to imagine. They were doing what they had been doing, what their fathers had done, and their fathers before them. Since the small island of Nantucket had discovered that the deep ocean was a treasury of light and had sent men out to open it, the iron went in. The whale ran. The line screamed through the chocks. And eventually, in the spreading stillness after the flurry, the men in the boat sat exhausted in the reddened water, looking at what they had done, and the enormous animal that had swum in the deep ocean for 40 years lay still beside them. The blubber was flensed, the head matter saved, the body processed through the try-works over the course of 2 days, while the smoke rose into the Pacific sky and the oil flowed into barrels. The barrels went into the hold. The voyage continued. Months later, years perhaps, the ship returned to New Bedford. The oil was sold to merchants. The merchants sold it to chandlers. The chandlers processed it into lamp oil and candles and sold it to distributors. The distributors sent it to merchants in cities and towns from Boston to Baltimore. The merchants sold it to families who carried it home and filled their lamps with it. And on an October evening in the early 1840s, it burned in a chandelier in a dining room, while a family gathered for supper in its warm light, unaware of the extraordinary journey by which the light in their room had arrived. The whaling era lasted, in its American incarnation, roughly from the 1690s to the 1920s, a span of 2.5 centuries, during which the relationship between human industrial ambition and the natural world was worked out in terms of unprecedented clarity and cost. The industry destroyed most of the whale populations it depended on. It exploited the men who crewed its ships with a systematic thoroughness that deserves to be called by its proper name. It made a small number of people very wealthy and left most of its participants with nothing but damaged health and stories that grew in the telling. It also, in its prime, achieved something genuinely remarkable, a global enterprise of extraordinary scope and complexity, organized without the technologies we would now consider indispensable, sustained by human skill and courage and endurance across the greatest distances and in the most hostile environments that the surface of the earth provides. The light that it produced is gone now, replaced by electricity and refined petroleum, and the cheerful indifference of a world that has moved past its own history without pausing to understand it. The whales are still there, reduced, cautious, their populations recovering slowly from depletions that took centuries to accomplish. Scientists with hydrophones have recorded their communications across ocean basins, have documented the cultural transmission of learned behaviors between generations, have begun to map the social complexity of populations that were nearly destroyed before anyone thought to ask what kind of beings they actually were. What we owe to the whaling era is harder to compute than the number of barrels produced, or the number of voyages made, or the price that oil commanded on a given date in the New Bedford market. We owe to it the Industrial Revolution, in at least some part, the precise instruments and well-lit factories, and mechanically lubricated looms that bootstrapped industrial civilization into existence. We owe to it a literature, Melville above all, but also the hundreds of logbooks and journals and memoirs that constitute one of the most vivid documentary records of any industry in history. We owe to it, in some uncomfortable sense, the world we live in, the world of cheap manufactured goods and global trade, and the expectation of continuous economic growth that the early Industrial Revolution established and that whale oil helped, briefly, to sustain. And we owe to the whales themselves a debt that cannot be repaid, but ought, at minimum, to be acknowledged. The acknowledgement that they were not merely a resource, not merely a stockpile of useful products waiting to be extracted, but living beings of intelligence and complexity who inhabited this planet long before we arrived and who will, if we allow it, continue to inhabit it long after the current human era has passed. The oil that lit the 19th century world swam in the deep ocean for 20 million years. It deserved better than it got. So did the men who went to sea to bring it home. So, perhaps do we, in that we live downstream of all of it, in a world shaped by choices made before we were born, consuming light that we did not have to pay for, warming ourselves at a fire whose cost fell on others. The ships are gone. The try-works are cold. The masthead lookout, who once cried, "There she blows," from 90 feet above the Pacific swell, is 2 centuries in his grave. But somewhere in the deep ocean, in the cold, dark water below the reach of light, a sperm whale is diving, hunting with its ancient sonar, clicking its clicks into the dark, as its ancestors did before the first whale ship ever left Nantucket Harbor, as they did through all the centuries of the hunt, and as they do tonight, and will do tomorrow, and will do, we can hope, for a very long time to come.